I'd like to call the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission meeting to order. As usual, we have a very full and very meaty agenda with lots of topics that we're going to need to wrestle with during the General Assembly. So it's great to have this kind of backup of information for us. And Hal, could you go through the agenda?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the Commission. I'm Hal Greer, the Staff Director of JLARC. We have an education-focused agenda this morning. We'll present the findings from our review of the pandemic impacts on K-12 education. Next, we'll present the results of our review of higher education financial aid. And then finally, we'll present the findings from our review of Virginia 529's excess surplus funds. But before we get to our presentations, Madam Chair, I'd like to turn it back over to you for you and the other members of the Commission to consider JLARC study topics for the coming year.
Yes, and I'd like to recognize Senator McPike, who chaired the subcommittee that met on this subject.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The topic subcommittee met on October 17th. We went through, I guess, about 14 different topic areas that were presented to the group. I think we had a good collaborative discussion between both chambers and arrived at a presentation of 7 potential topic areas that are on the screen before you. Both money committees, I believe, had recommended taking a look at the eligibility for enhanced retirement benefits across multiple sectors. That is one of the recommendations, Madam Chair. Additionally, there's a strong recommendation for taking a look at the state-operated inpatient psychiatric hospitals. That was a consistent theme, as well as a recommendation from staff. Additionally, the effectiveness and self-sufficiency programs, taking a look at those, as well as child care. I think the subcommittee had some pretty good discussions about the frequency of which child care has come up across different boards and commissions, as well as our own constituencies. Additionally, there was, I think, recommendations from a money committee for the taking a look at the adequacy and availability of legal representation for indigent defendants, as well as the Commonwealth Attorney staffing is a recommended topic. The supply of qualified individuals to fill K-12 teaching programs was also another one that was of significant, I think, interest to the group based on making sure we understand the impacts of our teachers, what it takes to recruit and retain teachers. That was a pretty consistent theme across the subtopic committee members as well. And also taking a look at Go Virginia. This is a program that has not yet taken a peek at, and there was some discussion of the subcommittee and is now included on the list. And finally, Madam Chair, the effectiveness of Virginia's workforce training programs was a part of the discussion, and subsequent to that meeting, there's been some, I guess, additional review and recommendation on that. While it is an area that is important to look at, there's, I think, a couple different factors, one of which is the Northam administration had just put out a study in December of 2021. And additionally, I know the Young administration is actually looking at significant restructuring right now, and so I'd like to give the administration some opportunities to utilize the prior report as well as their own review, I think, before we assign our great JLARC staff to look at it. And so I'd like to propose that the ones on the list be adopted, excluding the workforce review.
Is there any discussion on this?
Madam Chairman.
Senator Norman.
Good morning, Madam Chairman. My question is directed at how many times on commissions we have subcommittees that have various titles that review potential studies for recommendations to the commission. And my question to you is, based upon your current workload, what is the elasticity that you and your team have on taking on additional studies beyond that which you're currently committed to? And there are 7, several of which are challenging from a manpower and hours standpoint.
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, thank you for the question, Senator. We have evaluated our capacity for the coming year, and we feel like we could do 6 of these 7 studies. So but that would take all of our capacity if we did 6 of the 7 on this list. I think one thing that we would share is that if another study topic came up during the session, which has happened in the past, it becomes a higher priority, we could certainly decide, and with the decision of the commission, to take one of these and delay it, and then take on the one that is determined to be more urgent by the full General Assembly would be how I'd answer that.
Madam Chairman.
Continue, Senator.
Oh, excuse me. No, well, Madam Chairman is much more attractive, but we won't go there. That is a concern that I have. You know, legislators, including myself, suffer from terminal hubris. And we put in legislation during a session, particularly as it relates to studies that we think is going to change the rotation of the axis of the Earth. And then that puts pressures on the commission to make certain determinations on the prioritization. And that is a real concern that I had, Hal. I didn't know how many you felt you could absorb out of that, but I promise you, in 2023, which may be a moderate election year, that there are going to be those who are going to want to advocate some study or something to try to enhance their marketability, and that's a concern that I have.
Hal, you care to respond, or, and the long and the short, Hal, correct me if I'm wrong, if we approve this, that is your workload for the 23 year, and no matter what political dynamics we might want to exercise this coming session, there would not be room for y'all to integrate any of those in the coming workload.
Well, I guess I would say 2 things. We could, certainly the commission could have a brief meeting in January or whenever, if another study comes to the fore that's determined a higher priority, and we could decide to delay one of these studies. That has happened before, so we could do that and make that adjustment if something comes up. I guess the other thing I would say, though, is last year we didn't have any studies that came through the session, so I want to have our staff fully utilized. And so my preference would be to get 6 of these and be directed to do 6 of these. So if nothing does come up during the session, we will have a full workload for the coming year.
Hal, I was trying to set you up to just say yes, but anyway. So further questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to echo Chairman McPike's comments in regard to the workforce training. We've had a briefing on what the Secretary proposes, and I think it is in the best interest at this time to withdraw that request for study. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions or comments? If not, we would need to entertain a motion to approve the subcommittee recommendation. Do I hear such a motion?
So moved.
Do I hear a second? Second. Moved properly seconded to adopt the subcommittee's recommendation for studies for the 23 work year. There's no further discussion on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. You got your workload there, Hal. There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Mr.
And
Vice
I believe
Chair,
next we're going to be hearing on the pandemic impact of K-12.
that is correct. Our second agenda item this morning is in response to a joint resolution from the 2021 session directing us to review the impact of the pandemic on the K-12 education system. We focused on the impact to students in terms of attendance, behavior in the classroom, mental health issues, and academic skills. We also looked at the impact to teachers in terms of school divisions' ability to still maintain an adequate number of high-quality teachers. The General Assembly has already taken important actions to begin to address the adverse impacts of the pandemic. You have doubled funding this year for reading remediation, created a chronic attendance recovery program, and appropriated funds for teacher salary raises and teacher bonuses. As you'll hear in a moment, we are recommending other measures that we believe will augment what is already underway and help to address the challenges faced. Madam Chair, you will hear this morning that the current state of the teacher workforce is a major concern coming out of the pandemic. A strong teacher workforce remains the backbone of a strong education system, and ensuring that we have one needs to be the state's highest education priority. The state needs to do all that it can to support teachers in the classroom and to support the development, recruitment, and retention of high-quality teachers. I want to thank Superintendent Balo and her staff for their cooperation. They worked very closely with us throughout the project to provide us with a tremendous amount of data on students and teachers. I'd now like to turn it over to Justin Brown, who oversaw the study and has extensive experience in reviewing K-12. Justin?
Thanks, Hal. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. Just real briefly before I bring Joe up, just a couple of things to keep in mind as he goes through this information. As Hal said, this in this project, we focused on what happened during the pandemic and how to address those issues. So just to put this into context, means we didn't look at whether the state is using the right academic standards. We didn't go back in time and evaluate or critique decisions made by school divisions or past general assemblies or prior administrations. We just focused on kind of what happened and how to fix it. I also want to say we're not evaluating the overall level of K-12 funding in this report, but I did want to remind you, speaking of studies, we have a very large review of the state's entire K-12 funding formula underway, and we're going to give you a status report of that next month, and we're going to finish that and present it to you sometime next summer. And as Hal mentioned, you've done some things already to start to try to help, which is great. And divisions in our conversations with them have told us they also have a lot underway. So given that and what we're hearing from teachers, which is they're pretty worn out, and a lot of these students can only absorb so much in terms of remediation, it's going to take a while to catch up. So we're trying to be mindful of that in terms of what we recommend to you this morning and not try to push too much through the system. So we're focusing on kind of temporary, targeted efforts here in areas where we think that there are gaps. And we're recommending things that should be considered in addition to other things that might come up that are very well important. Some of these things we weighed in on the past. These are things like using best practices for instruction, data-driven academic remediation, year-round schools. We did a report on that a long, long time ago that is still kind of being used, and a better approach to the state helping really low-performing school divisions. So all those things still make sense. Last thing I'll say is a big theme of our work over the years is that because we have a local system, it's ultimately about specific divisions, not the state averages. So you're going to see a lot of our proposals that are kind of using data to target specific types of kids in specific divisions that really need assistance. So with that in mind, I'd like to bring Joe up, Madam Chairman, and give you an overview of the report.
Thank you, Justin. Good morning, Madam Chair.
Good morning.
And members of the Commission. As Justin said, my name is Joe McMahon. I was the project leader for our review of the pandemic's impact on public education. Working with me on this project were Christine Wolf, Nick Galvin, Kate Hopkins, and Laura White. Kind of follow up what Justin just talked about. Our study here is to review the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Virginia's public K-12 education system. That includes student well-being, student academic achievement and achievement gaps, programs to address learning loss, including resource gaps and barriers to implementing those programs, and school staffing. And as Justin said, this is in contrast to that standards of quality study that JLARC's also working on. We're not looking at permanent changes to spending or staffing or assessing those levels, but rather taking a more narrow and targeted approach to the pandemic. Our research activities included interviews with experts, education stakeholder groups, school staff and parents, extensive data analysis, and a survey of school division superintendents, as well as another survey of staff across a representative sample of 47 schools and 12 divisions across the state. I'll start with our key findings. The pandemic was an unprecedented disruption for K-12 students and staff. As students returned to in-person learning, chronic absenteeism, classroom behavior, and reported mental health issues have worsened. Multiple indicators of student academic achievement declined during the pandemic, but some have started to rebound as students have returned to in-person learning. The teacher workforce is smaller, less qualified, and less satisfied with their job than prior to the pandemic. We've got 4 sections today on the presentation. I can start off with some background, and I'll pause at the end of each of these sections for questions. Just a quick refresher. All schools went fully remote in mid-March of 2020. It's directed by the state and stayed that way for the remainder of the school year. The mode for delivering instruction in that 2020-21 school year was mixed. Most schools started out either with remote learning or a hybrid model. As the year progressed, they shifted more to hybrid learning or in-person instruction. And then by the fall of 21, for that 21-22 year, all school divisions were primarily using in-person instruction. I do want to add here, you're going to hear a lot during this presentation about the negative impacts of the pandemic to students and staff. and how remote learning was a contributing factor in all that. However, please keep in mind at the time of these decisions, division leadership were balancing several complex factors, including COVID-19 transmission, the adequacy of facilities to safely host learning, and also the health and safety concerns of their staff, students, and their families. Also, as you're probably well aware, remote instruction caused challenges for many students. At the top of that list were an inability to stay focused or the lack of a responsible adult at home to help guide and support them. In addition, about 6% of students statewide lacked adequate internet service, while about 5% lacked their own dedicated IT device. Due to these challenges, as well as health and safety concerns associated with the pandemic, K-12 enrollment declined about 3% statewide. Most of that decline can be attributed to families choosing to homeschool their children, fewer kids entering kindergarten, as families often waited another year before doing so, or families choosing to switch their students to private school. Another important thing to keep in mind is that there is substantial federal and state assistance already underway to school divisions. This includes a total of $3.3 billion of federal stimulus funds to Virginia for public education, most of which goes to school divisions and must be used or obligated by late 2024. There's also major state initiatives underway, including an attendance support program, new and expanded early childhood reading initiatives, and state funding for school staff raises and bonuses. Concludes the background. I can pause here for any questions.
Yes, Delegate Plum.
I'm sure I would ask the question. I noticed now that one of the recommendations on what we can do to kind of turn around the decline is to use up the federal monies. As I understand it, the federal monies, of course, while they're substantial, if you were to start ongoing programs to improve students' achievement and so on, you would expect some follow-up. Do we have any proposals before us to take on the responsibility for those programs we started in the federal money to continue them forward, if you understand what I mean?
I do. Madam Chair, Delegate Plum, we don't have specific recommendations aimed at that, but what you're going to see, I think, is that several of our recommendations for these targeted solutions, I mean, we do indicate that they could be temporary. It'd be up to you all's discretion, but some of these targeted interventions that we're talking about could be continued through or past when those federal funds run out to support some of those efforts in the key areas that we've identified.
Madam Chair, can I also just?
Yes, Senator Norman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Looking at the bullet points on your summary on page 8, divisions have substantial remaining federal funds. Do we have a list of those divisions that have substantial federal funds as contrasted to those that do not?
Madam Chair, Senator, yes and no. There's been some national research groups that have looked into this, and they give some idea. We talk to school divisions, and we can talk at a high level about what they've said they've used those funds for. There was language in the Appropriation Act for this year that requires school divisions to report on how they've spent those funds or whether they've obligated the remaining funds. Unfortunately, that report is set to come out next year, I think September of 2023. So there will be that required report from all divisions to DOE that will give a better idea of that. Unfortunately, it's still not available yet.
Madam Chairman.
Yes, Senator Norman.
Thank you. Going into the 2023 session of the Virginia General Assembly, when fiscal considerations will be undertaken to amend the biennium budget, will we know what jurisdictions have substantial financial resources from federal dollars they have not spent?
That, Madam Chair, yeah, and that's what I was getting. That official report won't be out till later next year. We could follow up with you to let you know what is available, but DOE may also have much better insight into that than I do in their finance office.
Yeah, you all have some data on it. The administration's going to have some information on that, and I don't know if you want to talk about it yet, but there'll be some numbers to use available from the administration this session.
Okay, thank you.
You may want to talk about that more, but yeah.
And
They're
if I
nodding their
might
heads.
put in, just, it's not relevant to our conversation exactly, but it's something that's really been kind of perplexing me is why we talk about numbers of divisions as if that means something when they range in size from fewer than 5,000 to more than 150,000. So they're hardly equal in terms of the impact. So if at some point we could think about how we could deal with that differently or make it more explicit, that would be helpful. Okay, that's my editorial irrelevant comment. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to student attendance, behavior, and mental health. We found that chronic absenteeism substantially increased when students returned to in-person instruction, and there's an attendance support grant program beginning soon to try to address this. Chronic absenteeism nearly doubled after the onset of the pandemic, resulting in 19% of students statewide being chronically absent during the last school year. Some of that can be attributed to illness and quarantine related to the pandemic, but school staff told us that's not the only factor, as disruptions to routine and good attendance habits also contributed. This poor attendance is concerning because it affects student engagement, their ability to learn, their progress, and outcomes. There is a state effort underway. In the 2022 budget, the General Assembly included $3.5 million to VDOE to contract with a private vendor to develop an attendance support program for next year. The next finding is that student behavior was a major problem upon the return to in-person learning. School staff responding to a JLARC survey rated student behavior as the most serious issue to address coming out of the pandemic. Over half reported student behavior as a very serious problem that they faced. A large majority of staff cited both increases in the number and severity of behavioral issues. Poor student behavior can negatively affect the ability of the student to learn, distract their peers, and make work more challenging for teachers and other school staff. The state has an existing behavior program, but it's unlikely able to meet demand. The state's behavioral support program is operated through the Virginia Tiered Systems of Supports. VTSS staff offer coaching, training, and support to staff in participating schools related to classroom management and fostering positive behavior. At its current scale, only 1/3 of schools statewide have participated, and there is unmet demand, both from schools that wish to begin participating in the program and from schools who already participate but have expressed the need for additional support as a result of more challenging student behavior. Therefore, we have a policy option to consider, and that would be that the General Assembly could fund the Virginia Tiered Systems of Supports to provide training and coaching on behavior and classroom management to staff at additional schools. Our next finding is that K through 12 staff, experts, and students report concerns about student mental health during the pandemic. Half of school staff responding to JLARC's survey reported student anxiety or mental health as being a very serious issue. We also talked to behavioral health and medical practitioners, and they concurred. We had pediatricians sharing that their practices had essentially become mental health practices. There's also data directly from students about a range of mental health issues. Middle school and high school students report prevalence of issues of anxiety, worrying, or feeling sad. They also report concerning high rates of more serious issues. 13% of high school students said they have seriously contemplated suicide. 4% said they have attempted suicide at least once. Our findings in this area are that the role of school counselor is not clearly defined, which can limit direct counseling to students. And divisions have particularly high vacancy rates for school psychologists. School counselors make up the largest portion of school-based mental health support staff. The Code of Virginia requires counselors to spend at least 80% of their time on providing direct counseling to students. However, code does not clearly define which activities are considered and not considered to be direct counseling. Counselors are frequently asked to perform non-counseling activities like test administration, clerical duties, and covering classes that can detract from their ability to help students. Next, divisions are having a hard time staffing their available school psychologist positions to address the high demand for mental health services. 11% of school psychologist positions statewide are vacant, one of the highest rates among all types of staff. And this is further compounded by the fact that even if schools were fully staffed, they would still be well below the recommended ratio according to national standards. In short, school psychologists are spread very thin. We have 2 recommendations in this area. First, the General Assembly may wish to consider amending the code to more clearly define direct school counseling and expressly exclude administrative activities from that role, and will allow qualified licensed psychologists in other fields to be provisionally licensed as a school psychologist. Please note there is a formal VDOE work group in 2019 that has already done a lot of the work towards coming up with that definition of direct counseling. And then in addition, there is similar legislation from Delegate Wilt this past session that created a provisional license pathway for school counselors, and that would be very similar to what we envision here with the psychologist recommendation. I can pause here.
Madam Chairman.
Yes, Senator Delegate Orrick.
Madam Chair, could we go back to the previous slide? No, there we go. Given from everything I understand, a private licensed psychologist is going to earn scads more money in the private sector.
Yes.
So why would allowing them to be provisionally licensed do anything to address the shortage? Is not part of the problem the fact that with the qualifications to be a psychologist, we're not going to be able to pay them enough under the current funding scheme in a school setting, and they would be better off financially to hang out their own shingle? How is that going to help to solve the problem?
Madam Chair. Delegate, you are absolutely correct. We don't envision this being a world changer where tons of psychologists flock to the schools to help, but we did hear that anecdotally there is potentially some interest there that people would pursue this. And the other thing with school psychologists and just the ratios and the amount of students they serve, even a handful, 10, 20, 30, is going to do a lot to address that current high vacancy rate statewide.
Madam Chairman, follow up.
Yes.
Is there anything currently that would preclude a school division from hiring them under a contract basis and not making them true school employees?
Yeah, on that specific question, I'd have to follow up. And I know that school psychologist is that very specific license type. So I think to do some of the special ed evaluations and things of that nature, they would need that type of license. We can say that we have seen school divisions doing these partnerships with community-based providers and basically contracting out that service to serve in the purely like counseling, psychologist, behavioral health role. So there are divisions that are doing that, but it's not fulfilling all those formal responsibilities of a school psychologist.
Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In reference to slide number 18, so I'm wondering there at the top of each of those columns, did the students express what they were feeling nervous or anxious or on edge about, what they were not able to stop, controlling their worrying? And so what was the core of their angst?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a challenging one. So this is from VDOE's climate survey. We didn't collect this personally, but I do know talking to staff and parents and families, it really is a little bit of everything. I definitely don't want to blame this all on the pandemic in the last 2 years. It is the health crisis, it's the direct disruptions in person instruction, but it's other things like the news and political unrest, it's social media. So it's really this convergence of all these factors that people talked about when citing some of these numbers.
Madam Chairman,
Yes.
I appreciate
Senator Norman.
that Delegate Orrock comes out of education. I've read a fair amount about this only because a member of my family continues to be a public teacher. And it's interesting, her observations are some of the behavior is exacerbated by the lack of socialization that did not take place during the pandemic situation, where many of them were at home, and that was an issue. Her observations particularly see it egregious where some of the children were latchkey, and I don't use that term derogatorily, but just descriptive. But another group of students that have really had an exacerbated situation are those that have IEPs. And frequently they have a behavioral overlay with other issues. And I'm not sure that there's a focus on dealing with those students, because it does require additional resources, including some of the issues that you've addressed. And I don't know what we can do about it, but it is a definite problem.
Absolutely.
I don't see any further questions at this point.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Sarah Norma. Those are additional factors we absolutely heard as we went through this, just that pause in the instruction and what that meant for everyone's social and behavior development. So moving on to student academic performance. The pandemic had a negative effect on student academic achievement in Virginia and nationwide. Early childhood literacy, as measured by the PALS assessment, declined. Reading and math SOL scores have generally begun to rebound in 2022, but remain below pre-pandemic levels. Fourth grade reading and math scores declined more than the national average from 2019 to 2022 on a national assessment, while eighth grade reading and math scores reflected national trends. And some pre-existing achievement gaps among Virginia students widened, especially among younger students. Some more context about what all that means. These declines in student performance are noteworthy. Prior to the pandemic, most indicators had been relatively stable in Virginia, with the exception of a slight declining trend in reading performance. Divisions that relied longer on remote instruction generally experienced larger declines, but have also rebounded by more. And experts estimate that it will take 3 to 5 years for students to return to pre-pandemic achievement levels. It's also important to note, in context, to note that the state and school divisions have efforts underway. During our work, divisions reported hiring more instructional staff, providing tutoring, and adding instructional time through before and after school programs and summer school. The state recently funded new early childhood reading programs, and VDOE is planning to establish learning recovery grants and tutoring initiatives. Despite these efforts, improvements will take time. We consistently heard from school division leadership that teachers and students can only absorb so much additional instruction at once, and staff burnout vacancies are often limiting the amount of additional instruction that can be delivered. Our first finding in this area are that multiple indicators show a decline in reading and literacy skills during the pandemic. Average third and eighth grade reading scores on the state's SOL tests were lower in 2022 than the average performance prior to the pandemic, although there's a slight rebound in this most recent year. That corresponds with the decline in the proportion of students that pass the reading test, which is the pass rate on those bars you see there on the right. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's also declines in early childhood literacy for kindergarten through second grade as measured by the state's PALS test. At the division level, 2022 reading scores were lower than the pre-pandemic average in 113 of 132 divisions. Some division performance is of greater concern. Scores declined by 5% or more in 21 divisions. More than half of students failed their third grade reading SOL in 17 divisions. Many pre-existing achievement gaps in literacy widened among young students, according to PALS test results. Those red arrows up there show where gaps have widened, meaning that the average score between student subgroups have a wider gap than what existed prior to the pandemic. Widening gaps in performance increase for Black and Hispanic students compared to white students, and for economically disadvantaged students and English language learners compared to their peers. The National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP test, is administered to a representative sample of students from all states and is considered the most useful test for comparing student performance across different states. Looking at NAEP results in reading, we see that Virginia's fourth graders' performance declined more than the national average during the course of the pandemic, while the decline in eighth grade reading approximately matched the national trend. That drop in fourth grade reading affected Virginia's national ranking, which had been consistently in the top 10 prior to the pandemic, but ranked 34th out of 50 states in 2022. There are substantial state-led efforts for improving reading performance that are underway. The General Assembly nearly doubled state funding for the Early Intervention Reading Initiative for this current school year. The General Assembly passed the Virginia Literacy Act, requiring schools to use evidence-based instructional practices for early childhood reading, more reading specialists, and professional development related to early childhood reading. In addition, this year's budget provides more funding for low-performing schools to hire additional reading specialists. Next, multiple indicators show a decline in math skills during the pandemic, and the state lacks a program to specifically address declines in elementary student math. Average third and eighth grade math scores on the 2022 SOL tests were lower than the average performance prior to the pandemic, and the decline in SOL math scores was greater than the decline in reading scores, but you can also see more rebound this past year. This trend is also reflected in the statewide pass rates. At the division level, math scores were lower in 2022 than the pre-pandemic average in almost all school divisions. Some division performance is of greater concern. Scores declined by 5% on average in 62 divisions. More than half of students in 18 divisions failed their third grade math test. More than half of students failed their eighth grade math test in 58 divisions. An interesting thing here, though, is that most achievement gaps did not widen for SOL tests, and you can see that where the gaps did widen, it was between subsets of students on that third grade math test, which are the red arrows here. Looking at the NAEP results in math, we see that Virginia's fourth grade student performance declined more than the national average during the course of the pandemic, while the decline in eighth grade math approximately matched the national trend. Like fourth grade reading, that decline in fourth grade math negatively impacted Virginia's 50-state ranking, dropping from the top 5 to 20th in the nation. As I mentioned, there are substantial efforts underway in the area of early childhood literacy, but there isn't anything similar for math among younger students. A new math instructional support program could be designed similar to existing programs for early reading intervention and algebra readiness. That means it would provide targeted, intensive help to elementary students who fail their math SOL tests. To give you a sense of what that could cost, we took the number of students who failed their third, fourth, and fifth grade math SOL tests and applied the teacher-to-student ratios used for the state's existing intervention programs. That results in a cost of $19 to $38 million for the state share of funding under those assumptions. This state funding would require a local match and could serve as a way to incentivize school divisions to allocate unused pandemic relief funds. The new math intervention program for younger students could be made temporary if desired, leaving it in place until student performance returns to pre-pandemic levels. Therefore, we have a recommendation to consider creating and funding a temporary math instructional improvement program to help elementary school students who fail their math standards of learning tests. Next, we found that there's a wider variation in academic skills among students in the same grade and classes. The standard deviation of student SOL scores, which is the amount of variation across individual scores relative to the average, was greater in 2022 than before the pandemic. Furthermore, we consistently heard about this wider variation through our survey and during focus groups with school teachers and principals. The greater variation in skills among students requires more individualized or small group instruction. These methods of instruction help focus on specific needs and students with similar skill levels. It is considered a best practice that is highly effective. However, teachers emphasize how difficult it is to individualize instruction without another adult in the classroom. Practically speaking, while the teacher is working with an individual student or small group, the remainder of the students in the classroom need something to keep them occupied. To paraphrase what we repeatedly heard from teachers, I can't do this on my own, and what do I do with the other 24 kids? One way to do this is through the use of instructional assistants, also referred to as teacher aides or paraprofessionals. Instructional assistants can help teachers facilitate instruction by working with a small group of students themselves or supervise the other students while the teacher works with that smaller group. Instructional assistants also help to address teacher workload concerns and other challenges they face following the pandemic, such as dealing with classroom management. Here's an illustration of how a state initiative could be structured, targeted, and funded. The cost would be proportional to the number of instructional assistant positions funded on a per-student basis. We also envision this as something that could be targeted to schools with the greatest need. There isn't a perfect way to measure that variation in student performance. However, you could use the state's accreditation system as a way to identify schools with the greatest overall level of need. It incorporates many of the elements of student performance, like test scores, of just student performance in general, like test scores, attendance, and graduation rates. You can see a wide range of projected costs based on the assumptions, ranging from $3 million annually by targeting a small subset of schools with a relatively high ratio of instructional assistants, to $34 million annually by targeting more schools with a greater number of positions. Again, any state funding here would require a local match and could serve as a way to incentivize divisions to use pandemic relief funds. And I'll also note that the current funding formula does provide money for instructional assistants for special education and some for kindergarten. And we also know that divisions use their own funding to hire these positions. What we're talking about here is in addition to those efforts due to these challenges that we're seeing coming out of the pandemic. So we have a recommendation here to consider providing additional temporary funding for a subset of schools to hire more instructional assistants.
Madam Chairman.
Yes, Delegate Orick.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, a couple different questions. The first, as we're looking at the challenges in the math scores, has anybody ever looked at the potential correlation between the reading challenges and poor performance on math tests, i.e. they can't read the questions, they can't understand how to work the problem, not because they don't have the math skills, but because they don't have the reading skills in order to allow them to be properly tested of their true math knowledge. Given the structure of our test being, it's all computerized, Has anybody ever looked at that? And that's not something that I think would be a part of your study, but per se, but.
Madam Chair, Delegate, not that I know of. I can speak just talking to the experts in the field and teachers that we did hear similar to what you're talking about, specifically like science scores can be affected if you're struggling with math because some of that science factors in math, and reading can also, like you said, impact their comprehension, but we didn't specifically look into that and I don't have anything on hand.
And further, if I may, Madam Chairman.
Yes.
I didn't see anything in this part of performance that looked into competency tests in our career and technical field area. And I'm presuming, as a former career and tech teacher, that basically we lost a year of career and technology instruction because I don't know any way you can teach those skills in a virtual climate. And so my question, maybe more to the DOE folks that are in the room, the Secretary of Ed, we've got to come up with some means whereby we try and remediate those kids who lost a year or more in the practical arts field and also in the sciences where there were typically labs involved in chemistry and biology and they didn't have that lab experience. So it's more than just, y'all have done a great job in what you've fleshed out, but we've got a lot bigger issues than what this report covers because of that instructional deficit that couldn't be addressed in a virtual climate.
Yeah. Madam Chair, yeah, we absolutely heard about that too, and that's one of the frustrating and unfortunate things with everything that has happened. I mean, some of those high schoolers that in those with labs and the career and technical, have had a really big chunk of their entire high school experience affected by this, and a lot of them have now graduated and moved on. So, that's one of those frustrating things to try to address.
And Madam Chair, just more
Sure.
of just a comment, because I think we're going to see the effects of this in our workforce going forward in the next several years, because these people weren't able to get industry certifications. And therefore, that's exacerbating, short and long term, some of the hiring challenges that we're going to see out there in the career fields.
Delegate Ware.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You spoke so quickly, there are a couple of things that I wrote, but I'm not sure I got them correctly, so I just want to make sure that I did. On the math scores, I think what I heard you say was Virginia went from the top 5 to 20th in the nation. Is that correct?
Yep. On the fourth grade math, eighth grade math stayed roughly where it had been.
Fourth grade, that was fourth grade, and eighth grade?
Stayed about where it had been.
Okay. And then on the reading, Virginia went from the top 10 to 34th in reading. And is that strictly the fourth grade, or?
Correct.
And then on the eighth grade, it was what?
Stayed pretty consistent, just a couple spots, one way or the other, which I don't have that in front of me. I will say, Justin.
So that is in the report, I take it, from what you've just been handed?
Yes. Page 43 of the report breaks down the NAEP in the fourth grade versus the eighth grade.
Looking at that, I mean, those are appalling numbers amidst a report which is, I can say as a teacher, it just is, it's appalling to see. Having spoken to friends who are still teaching and enduring some of the things they're enduring, I guess one of the things that comes to mind, or questions that occurs to me, and maybe this is in the report, is surely there must have been states that did not suffer this kind of decline. Did you identify those? Again, recognizing the limitations on aggregate scores, but were there places where there were alternatives to what we experienced?
I mean, looking at those fourth grade scores and what you pointed out, for Virginia to drop that much, if every state would have dropped that much, we would have relatively stayed in the same place. So just factually, with the performance on those tests in the fourth grade level, Virginia did drop more. Why that occurred, you start running into a lot of reasons. Virginia did tend to be a little bit more reliant on remote learning than other states, and there's a slight to moderate correlation there, but it's definitely not the only thing going on. I will say one of the unfortunate things with these NAEP results, they came out 2 weeks ago from today. Sure. So that 2022 information is all pretty new, so we didn't have a chance to really drill into that state by state and what was going on.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And then Senator Spruill.
And I may have missed it in the finer details as you were talking, but it seems kind of the bottom line here is we're going to need more teachers or teachers' assistants. And the monies that you've shared here today, I mean, you feel like that those dollars correlate with the number of those individuals that we're going to need? Because, my initial question is, where are you going to find these teachers? Okay, they're just not flocking to the education institutions to get that kind of training to go into the education field. So we feel like we're going to put more money into it to attract them. And then you said earlier, you feel like 3 to 5 years we can kind of get back to where we need to be. That's the approach that you took. That's how you've calculated it all.
Mm-hmm. Madam Chair, Delegate, yes, we did. On each of these recommendations, we tried to talk about if you're going to target it, where you would target it. As you know, with public education, when you start doing things system-wide, the numbers quickly get really big. So we talked about where you would target them, how you would target them, potentially how long you would target them. But it is really, there's a lot of variability there. You'll see on the instructional aid recommendation, where if you just target that narrow subset of schools with an instructional assistant at 1 to every 100 students, it's only a couple $1 million statewide. We've aligned in the report, if you were to take all the schools that were accredited with conditions, that's 200 some, I believe, and did that 1 to 20 more intensive ratio, then you're getting up near $100 million. So it really comes down to these trade-offs on how you want to target it. But we tried to lay out all those options for you all in these recommendations.
Well, Madam Chair, if I might, just to
Sorry.
Just to emphasize, yeah, you're making a really key point here. And in the written report, kind of whenever we have a recommendation that says, provide some additional money, there's a barrier here in terms of people that are going to want to go into these classrooms, whether it's instructional assistants or tutors. And so we thought the instructional assistants, you'd have a better shot than kind of instantly manufacturing, 3,000 more qualified teachers. Because what you said about we say this in here, the folks going into the teacher prep programs has steadily declined. So earlier we said a useful study for us would be to, what can we do to make the teacher pipeline start expanding again? So we're going to try to take that on next year. But it's a very real impediment. I think when we get to the section on teachers, not only is it an impediment, it's hard to be a teacher right now. We interacted with a lot of them. And so it's a sobering message in terms of the people we need to get the students out of this are having a really tough time. So I think you put your finger on something really critical for everybody to understand.
It seems to me that, and the report says so, that it's a matter of respect for the teachers and also its compensation, as well as the heavy workload. But that reminds me of what my then teenage son used to tell me all the time, which was, Mom, nothing says you love me quite like cash. And I think that fits here. Okay, Senator Sproul.
I get that from my grandkids all the time, cash. Thank you. The question too is that the scores are dropping in reading and in math. You think the last 2 years and a half, because of the COVID-19, a lot of kids were out of school. A lot of them did not have those labs, those computers. They was home for almost 2 years doing nothing, especially those areas when you got 4 or 5 kids in a home, and there was no laptop, no nothing. They was home for 2 years, and now you're doing all this testing. I've been home for 2 years in a lot of cases doing nothing. Now you're gonna give me a test and want to know why I'm dropping? So now you're gonna throw money? So my question is that you think because of the last 2 years and a half, because of a lot of kids were home doing nothing, and now all of a sudden you're gonna test me that I was gone for 2 years and a half. You think that was part of the problem?
Madam Chair. Yep, Senator. Yeah, you are right, and I think I want to pass on 1 or 2 bullet points here, but we do a lot of information, both Chapter 1 and Chapter 6 of this report, that just talks about those things you're talking about, the barriers during this remote and hybrid learning, and what that meant for students as far as just, being away from just that routine day-to-day instruction that they had got, and how that does impact the tests. During the pandemic itself, there was a little
Madam
bit
Chair,
Go.
so you give me a political answer. Was I right?
Oh, yeah, you're.
Oh, praise the Lord. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, it's just these test scores are a result of those 2 years.
Senator Locke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just came back from a 2-day conference dealing with early childhood education, and where states are putting their resources into early childhood education, and they see certainly an impact that has on students and scores and achievement as students go into kindergarten and first, second, third grade. And the one thing that stuck with me as it relates to NAEP scores, rather than using the NAEP scores as a gotcha, why don't we say that the achievement gap did not start as a consequence of the pandemic? The achievement gaps were there prior to the pandemic. And the pandemic exacerbated the problem. And that what happened with NAEP scores were also exacerbated as a consequence of the pandemic. And children who start behind as a consequence of lacking early childhood education, if they start behind, they stay behind. And that exacerbation of a problem only continues to exacerbate as a direct result. So if a child is having problems in the third grade, it didn't start in the third grade, and it didn't start in the second grade. It started much earlier on. So we can't say that because of what has happened with the NAEP scores in the fourth grade and in the eighth grade is a consequence of, what's happened as a consequence of the pandemic. All of that started much earlier on. And we can't say, aha, we got you. Our NAEP scores have gone down in fourth grade, our NAEPs in math and reading, and they've gone down in eighth grade, how horrible we're doing, as teachers, as administrators, as in our school system. There's something else going on here, and it happened prior to the pandemic, and we need to figure out what we can do better, as a state to fix the problem, rather than pointing fingers at people saying, oh, how horrible we are.
Anyone else at this point? Okay.
Moving on to our final section here, and we'll cover teacher recruitment and retention and teacher quality. I'll start with what teachers cited as the most serious issue they face since the onset of the pandemic. These include more students with behavior and mental health issues, low pay, lack of respect from parents and the public, and higher workload because of unfilled vacancies. The strategies most favored by division leadership and teachers to address these concerns tended to be high cost or long-term. These included higher salaries, smaller class sizes, and less standardized testing. Our recommendations in this report would focus on targeted approaches to address the impacts of the pandemic, but would in part address these strategies favored by teachers, such as instructional assistance to help reduce workload and targeted additional compensation that I'll discuss in this section. The state and school divisions have efforts underway to begin to address teacher workforce challenges. Virginia has several programs and initiatives for alternative paths to becoming a teacher. The General Assembly has invested in the teacher workforce with a 5% raise in each of FY23 and FY24, a one-time $1,000 bonus, and funding for teacher signing bonuses for the start of the current school year. VDOE has efforts underway to advertise and publicize the teaching profession, and they are developing a plan to address teacher shortages. Despite that, we found that more teachers have been leaving the workforce and fewer have been entering. There are more teacher vacancies, and Virginia is relying more on teachers who are not fully qualified. As you can see here, the numbers of teachers leaving the workforce between the 2020-21 school year and the 21-22 school year represented a 12% increase over the typical year prior to the pandemic, about 1,200 more teachers leaving than average. While the state doesn't yet have data available to measure how many teachers left prior to this current school year we just started, we can get a clue from VRS teacher plan data, and it does appear that the number of teachers leaving their job has continued at this higher than normal rate. On the other side, the number of teachers entering the workforce has declined by 15% compared to pre-pandemic averages. So that's about 12,000 fewer teachers getting a first-time license this past year. Those two opposing trends are contributing to problems with the teacher workforce. Divisions are struggling to have a high-quality teacher in many of their classrooms. This really matters because having a sufficient number of high-quality teachers is a driving factor in schools' ability to provide quality instruction to all students. Something is even more important in light of the negative impacts we've seen these past few years. First, we'll look at teacher vacancies. These are problematic because they can mean more workload for remaining teachers, less support for students, larger class sizes, or greater use of long-term substitute teachers. There were 2,800 teacher vacancies reported by school divisions in October of 2021. That's compared to about 800 in a typical year prior to the pandemic. Preliminary data for this school year indicates teacher vacancies have further increased, and we'll have more clear of a picture when vacancy data for October 22 is released later this year. The majority of divisions saw an increase in teacher vacancies for the 21-22 school year, with some faring worse than others. For instance, over 10% of teacher positions were vacant in 6 divisions. The other issue arising from these teacher workforce trends is that Virginia is relying more heavily on teachers who are not fully qualified. Many factors contribute to student performance, but research concludes that teacher quality matters most. As of the 21-22 school year, 9.5% of teachers were provisionally licensed, meaning they have not completed all of the required coursework to become a fully licensed teacher. And over 6% were teaching out of field, which means they're in a subject area where they're not certified to teach. Both represent increases from prior years. As you'd suspect, a fully licensed teacher working in the area which they are certified is going to be much more likely to provide high-quality instruction than one who is provisionally licensed or teaching out of field. This figure is a visual representation of the impact of the pandemic on the teacher workforce across divisions. It accounts for the level of change in the number of provisionally licensed teachers and the change in the number of teacher vacancies. The darker blue color represents divisions that have experienced the greatest adverse impacts to their teacher workforce over the past few years. Please note this map's only half the story. Some divisions started out in better position than others. So while this shows the change over the past 2 years, there's another map on page 64 of our report that shows where divisions' overall teacher workforce currently stands as of this past school year. Finally, we found that divisions are pessimistic about their ability to employ a suitable teacher workforce for the current school year, and teacher morale and job satisfaction is worse since the pandemic. "52% of divisions were not optimistic about being able to employ a suitable teacher workforce this year. This means they weren't confident that they'd have a sufficient number of high-quality teachers to effectively deliver day-to-day instruction. A majority of school divisions said that recruitment and retention has been harder for this current school year than even the previous 2 years, which were also affected by the pandemic. As I mentioned, preliminary vacancy and departure data supports continued workforce challenges. So, although teacher quality data is not available yet for this current school year, when you put all those indicators together, it could be expected to worsen further. For teachers that remain in the workforce, 72% reported lower morale than before the pandemic, 67% are less satisfied with their job, and half are less able to handle their workload. We surveyed school division leadership and staff with a long list of strategies that they think that could potentially help address the teacher workforce challenges. Teacher incentives that I'll walk through here were among those that rose to the top. In addition, in many cases, divisions have implemented some of these measures I'm about to show you on their own, pointed to their effectiveness. The first is teacher retention bonuses to address the problem of more teachers leaving the workforce. There's a lot of ways to structure and target these bonuses, which we discuss in the report. If the state were to provide its share of funding for teacher bonuses in divisions with higher rates of teacher turnover, it could come at an estimated cost between $1 million and $11 million. The next is teacher signing bonuses to help address the difficulty divisions are having when hiring teachers. These could be targeted to divisions with higher levels of vacancies and would be estimated to cost $1 to $4 million annually. Finally, there's not enough fully licensed teachers, So the state could help divisions reimburse provisionally licensed teachers for the costs of their coursework to become fully licensed. Efforts could target divisions with the greatest number of provisionally licensed teachers and could cost up to $1.2 million annually. Once again, the local portion of this could come from federal pandemic relief funds at the division level, at least in the near term. And as I mentioned, in the second half of Chapter 5 of our report, there's a lot more details on how these incentives could be structured and targeted to maximize their effectiveness. And we had 3 recommendations related to the teacher workforce here. The General Assembly may wish to consider providing the state share of funding targeted to divisions with teacher workforce challenges to be used for retention bonuses for current teachers, signing bonuses for new teachers, and for tuition assistance for provisionally licensed teachers to help with the costs of becoming fully licensed. Finally, I'd just like to quickly recap our key findings. The pandemic was an unprecedented disruption for students and staff. As students returned to in-person learning, chronic absenteeism, classroom behavior, and reported mental health issues have worsened. Multiple indicators of academic achievement have declined, but some have started to rebound. And the teacher workforce is smaller, less qualified, and less satisfied with their job than prior to the pandemic. That concludes my presentation for today, and I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Are there questions?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator McPike.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you bump back to slide 51, if you don't mind?
Sure.
And the question is around the measurement for qualified or not qualified. Was there also any finding of the factor of submissions of actually the information to the state and acceptance? I mean, I got like multiple complaints also. It's taken almost 10 months to get their endorsements to be recognized by VDOE, and with sometimes longer. And so some of them have completed the work, but it's not in the system. It's sort of floating out there somewhere. Did that also come up?
Yep, Madam Chair, yes, that has come up. And when we did our review of VDOE back in 2020, that also came up a lot too. It's just the licensing office and some of those problems you're talking about. We do have a recommendation in this report to just overall take a look, more of a look at the licensure process and the requirements for those certifications. So there's that actual, what's on paper, what do you have to do? But then there's just that physical process of submitting things, getting it approved, and getting your license. And then the short answer would be, if they had not been approved for that license at the time of that data collection, then they're going to show up in one of these groups.
One more
Yes.
follow-up.
Senator McPike.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you bump back to slide 49? Maybe it's a question or a comment, but this should scare the heck out of everyone that's interested in workforce development, job, the future of Virginia. I think the top slide would be worry enough, but in combo with the bottom chart, that is a widening gap that is going the wrong direction, that is not going to be supplied by ARPA funding, but by long-term funding solutions that we have to address. Sorry, there's more of a comment, but that should worry everybody in this room. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I couldn't agree more. Is there anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you all. It gave me a workout. I'd like to turn it over to the Secretary of Education, I believe, is going to be next on our agenda.
Yes.
Secretary Gadara.
Madam Secretary, good morning.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It's nice to be back with you again. I'd like to start just with a thank you to Director Greer, to Mr. Brown, and the entire JLARC team for capturing, analyzing, and providing great insights into the role of the COVID-19 impacting our children's lives, but also how we can learn from that and make sure that we pay attention to what we just heard, and that it gives us a sense of urgency of how do we make sure we get back on track. We all knew in our hearts and from our personal experiences that COVID-19 had unbelievably terrible impacts on our families and on our children. And now, as we all just heard, we have hard data, cold hard data, telling us that we are in crisis. and both in mental health and in the academic piece. And I want to share one more data point, and it's a data point of stories. I was out in Southwest last week, and brought me to tears to hear teachers and students and family members and counselors talking about what they are experiencing in classrooms. And just to give you one taste of that, one counselor described how they are now training their teachers in what they call all clear exercises, in which a child is so out of control that they have to clear the entire classroom to keep people safe. And it just breaks my heart when I hear that, and to hear that our children are in such crisis that it is impacting what's happening in our classrooms and impacting our students and our teachers and our families. Equally heart-wrenching are the data points about academic loss that we just also went through. We know that our children are in crisis. We are on the cusp of losing an entire generation of children if we do not start acting immediately to address this crisis. And Senator Locke, to your point, this is a moment to use data as a flashlight, not as a hammer, and to use it to rally everyone together and say this is an all hands on deck moment, and that we have to work together to make sure that we are seeing every child, we are meeting every child where he or she is, and we are getting that child what he or she needs to get back on track to be successful in life. The other piece I want to make sure, just from the conversations that we're just having, is that COVID did illuminate and exacerbate so many of the trends that were already there, including the gaps that Senator Locke brought up. But in addition, it also illuminated and exacerbated the really damning trend lines that had already started in terms of learning loss. And those trend lines are the things that are most scary, because we need to be able to turn those around quickly. We know starting in 2017, when you look at the charts that the JLARC report shows, and also that are in the NAEP numbers, that we had statistically significant declines across the board for all of our students. And I just want to spend a moment to give 3 highlights of those. You know, before we know this, and our students are not able to read, 42% of our second graders are not able to read independently and are not on track to do so by that critical milestone of 3rd grade, where you go from learning to read to reading to learn. And we know that that is a critical point, 42%. We know also that across the board on our ACT, our SOLs, our NAEP, that every single trend line is going in the wrong direction, and if it's a historic decline. And on NAEP, which is so important, it's the nation's report card for a reason. This gives us an opportunity to have a dipstick every 2 years and tell every single state how they are doing in making sure that every one of our students is being prepared for life. Well, not everyone. And what we know is that in Virginia, 4th grade, both in math and reading, and I want to repeat what was just shared to you because it's so incredibly heart-wrenching. We had the largest declines of any state in the nation on 4th grade reading and 4th grade math. We know across the country that those national averages went down, but we know that in Virginia, our declines in 4th grade on reading and math were 3 times worse than the national trend line. That's incredible. And just pause for a second. That gives you a sense of the incredible magnitude of the direction of that line. And that line is so harsh because every single one of our cohort groups had declines. I'm talking every ethnic group. I'm talking at all levels. Our highest achieving kids went down. Our lowest achievement kids went down. Our kids with special needs, our kids with economic disadvantage, our kids who are English language learners. Every single group of students in Virginia lost, and they lost at a bigger rate than any other state. We have to change this. And finally, this NAEP data proves to us and shows that we in Virginia have lost 20 years of progress. We were making progress. When you look back, and we know starting in 2014, 2004, 2004, we started raising expectations of our students and of our schools and of everyone. And guess what? We met those goals when we raised them. And what's happened is that we have continued to lose our focus on high expectations for every single child. And as a result, we're losing kids, and we're about ready to lose a generation, and we know we need to focus on this. 20 years of progress lost, and we know that we can do this. We know that we can keep our eyes on the ball and have high expectations again, support our teachers, support our families, support our students, and have high expectations for every single one. But this is a crisis, and I look forward to being back in front of you many times in the next several months so that together we can talk about what we can do. I don't have time to go over the letter that I put in the back. It's in the back of your report, but that lays out the 7 action steps that this administration is starting on immediately to start addressing this. And we look forward to coming back and working in partnership with the General Assembly to talk about so many of the things that the JLARC report represents. But I would like to address a few things that I just heard in the conversation, if that's appropriate, Madam Chair. First of all, on the $2 billion that remains right now regarding the question about how much of the federal recovery funds now remain. We will send to you, if it's appropriate, a chart that we've created showing as of October 31st of 2022, how many of the federal recovery funds are now available and sitting in local divisions bank accounts. That money is to be sent for learning recovery, and that money should not wait for several years and just parse it out. That money needs to be spent now on evidence-based practices that are going to address the learning losses that we heard about today and that are critical. And we're happy we'll share that with you all so you can see by each school division how much money remains. The second piece is in terms of what happened in terms of learning loss and school closure. We know, and there was a question that was asked about how did our NAEP scores compare to those other states, and did anyone do well? Most states did not. Most states did have declines. No one as bad as ours. I mean, ours was the worst. But we do know that there were places that there were bright spots, Utah, Wyoming, the Department of Defense schools. And when you look at those, and I know from my friend who was running the Wyoming schools at that point, they kept schools open. They kept teachers and students working together in vibrant learning environments. And we know that that is one of the biggest takeaways of this. Our kids need to be in school with caring teachers, with classmates, and in vibrant learning environments. And we now have the data to show that we must do everything possible to make sure every child has a caring teacher, has high expectations, and is in a vibrant learning environment so that they can be prepared for life. So I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you to the JLARC group for putting together a really important report that we should all keep on our desks and look at a lot. And I look forward to working with you over the next several months. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and we look forward to working with you also. Yes, Delegate Plum.
Madam Chair, I want to say to the Secretary, I appreciate your attitude and approach to resolving the issue. I do want to express to you, though, concern I had in terms of the letters to the JLARC from the report. Not specifically your letter, but rather the letter from the superintendent. And I'll just summarize one of the paragraphs in that letter that causes me some concern. The letter starts off saying a critical context that must also be recognized are the state-level actions during predating the pandemic that set in motion the eroding student achievement outcomes we are seeing in Virginia today, particularly among our most vulnerable students. And it goes on to say these pre-pandemic decisions must be quickly reversed at the state level to restore high expectations for schools and students and get them back on track towards success. The pandemic and long-standing closure of schools only serve to accelerate the regression of student proficiency in Virginia. And what I think would be helpful to us, since some of those decisions were no doubt made by us as a panel, made by us as legislators, and some, of course, were made within the administration. But if we want to reverse those decisions that led to the regression, that little dip that we're pointing out, it would be helpful to us if you told us exactly what those are. Not today. In a follow-up, tell us exactly what decisions led to the regression. And secondly, what are you doing about turning it around? Or what do we need to do to turn it around? Because candidly, I've seen this discussed too many times in partisan context where there's talking about predecessors doing things that led to our students not learning. And I can tell you that the people sitting at this diocese didn't have that in mind. And if those things happened, what were those things and what are you doing to turn them around? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Yep.
and Delegate, just real quick, I know we didn't have time to talk about today. I also, with your permission, I would love to send a deck that we produced for NAEP that also talked about some of those pieces to answer your question. But also, this will be something that will be talked about a great deal at the State Board of Education in the next 2 weeks and over the next several months. And so it will be a very public conversation about accreditation system changes and also about our definition of proficiency in the Commonwealth to make sure that we take it from the lowest definition of proficiency on our state test to the highest level of proficiency. But I'm happy to talk at any point with more detail with you about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Senator McPike.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for joining us this morning. In your letter, I think bullet point 3 says, hold ourselves and schools accountable. It further goes into basically holding the accreditation or de-accrediting certain schools based on performance. I hope that this statement also means that we're sort of in a budgetary process putting our money where our mouth is, because the same 20 years ago, this same language was used in the political arena of Virginia. We've seen 20 years worth of lack of funding across the board. With this in mind, I hope that there is a substantial, meaningful position by the governor in the budget to fund these schools. And it's because we've been through the realm on this in Virginia, and we've seen that 2 decades worth of underfunding, classroom sizes that are 1 teacher to 30 kids consistently through all of my kids' school and career in public schools, across many others, as well as the lack of early childhood education and many other significant impacts. So I'm hoping that the accountability is also here at the state level, not just picking on different school systems. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much.
Next up is higher education financial aid grant programs and awards.
That's correct, Madam Chair. You took significant action this past session, substantially increasing the funds that will be available to provide state financial aid to Virginia students who need it in order to attend institutions of higher education. This report complements the action taken by the General Assembly and provides recommendations to simplify and strengthen the financial award system in Virginia and to further ensure that the students with the greatest financial need at schools such as Norfolk State, George Mason, Virginia State, Old Dominion, and VCU are being appropriately prioritized to receive state financial aid assistance. The recommendations are also intended to help ensure that the full range of students, not just full-time students, will have access to financial aid that is essential to their pursuit of a higher education degree. I want to personally thank Peter Blake and his staff at Chev for their extensive, generous, and extremely valuable assistance in conducting this review. Tracy Smith oversaw the study, and Lauren Excel was the project leader for it. Lauren?
Thank you, Hal. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Lauren Excel, and I was the project leader for our review of higher education financial aid grant programs and awards. Landon Weber assisted me with this review, and I want to thank him for all of his hard work. We worked very closely with staff from Chev and the public four-year institutions, and I'd also like to thank them for their time and assistance. To fulfill our study mandate, we reviewed student financial aid at Virginia's public four-year institutions. We looked at the items listed on slide 2 for all public four years, including the public HBCUs. We did not review financial aid for private or public two-year institutions. We understand the importance of aid at these entities, though, especially the public 2 years. So we discussed our report recommendations with community college system staff to make sure they'd be both beneficial and applicable. Our primary research activities are listed on slide 3. I won't describe them for the sake of time, but I'll highlight that we interviewed and collected data from Chev and all 15 public four years. This helped us understand how financial aid works in different settings across the state. To briefly summarize our research, we found that financial aid has not kept pace with rising costs and students' declining ability to pay, causing substantial unmet need for students. Several state grant requirements prevent needy students from accessing state aid and increase financial aid staff's workload. Having separate state grant programs causes confusion among students. Students with similar financial need receive different state grant awards, and some grants are awarded to students with comparatively less need. And finally, Virginia should more effectively target limited state grant funding to the neediest students. There are 3 sections to my presentation this morning. I'll start with providing some information on higher education costs and financial aid trends. Higher education costs are a key driver of students' need for financial aid, and costs vary widely for in-state undergraduates at the public four years. Tuition and fees range from just over $9,000 per year at Virginia State to over $23,500 per year at William & Mary in 2020-21. The statewide average was just under $14,000, which you can see with that light blue line. Other living expenses, such as room and board, are also part of the higher education cost picture. When they're included, total cost range from nearly $20,500 per year in Norfolk State to nearly $37,000 per year at William & Mary. To help cover higher education costs, students can receive several types of financial aid, including federal, state, institutional, and other aid from private or local government sources. Financial aid from all sources totaled $671 million for in-state undergraduates in 2020-21, and you can see the level of support students received from the different types of aid in this figure on slide 7. State aid was over 1/4 of undergraduates' total aid. Over the past decade, the amount of assistance provided to students through most all types of financial aid has increased. Federal aid had a relatively modest increase. State aid grew nearly 50%, and institutional aid grew the most at 118%. Other aid actually decreased 7%, but it's a fairly small source of aid. Although financial aid has grown over the past decade, it hasn't kept pace with the growth in student need. Several trends contribute to this, including that tuition and fee costs increased 33% on average, adjusted for inflation. Students' expected family contribution towards higher education decreased 40% on average. And the number of students with no ability to pay grew 11%. Together, these three things mean that more students need financial aid, and the amount of aid needed per student has grown. Total financial aid awards have increased nearly 50%, but the increase hasn't been enough to offset the combined effect of growing costs and students' declining ability to pay. As a result, as of 2020-21, in-state undergraduates had $162 million in unmet tuition and fee need that had not been addressed through financial aid. This figure on slide 10 shows how unmet need breaks down by student ability to pay. And I'd like to call your attention to the dark portion showing students with no ability to pay, or $0 of expected family contribution. These students had nearly half of the state's unmet need, and they were largely concentrated at George Mason, Old Dominion, and Virginia Commonwealth University. When need is not addressed through financial aid, many students must take on debt. Specifically, 56% of in-state undergraduates who graduated in 2020-21 had debt when they got their degree. Their debt averaged nearly $30,000 per student and totaled $537 million. Students who start college but do not graduate also accumulate debt. Over half of the students who enrolled at but did not graduate from a Virginia public four-year in 2015-16 had debt. Importantly, total debt among in-state undergraduates has increased nearly 20% over the past decade. Students at Virginia's public access institutions, including HBCUs, have particularly high unmet financial need and debt. There's no formal definition of access institutions, so our team came up with a definition based on the portion of students that schools admit. Several public four-years admit nearly all of the undergraduates who apply, including George Mason, Old Dominion, Virginia Commonwealth, Norfolk State, and Virginia State. This group of institutions had nearly 3/4 of the state's total unmet need and over half of the statewide debt. They also had low retention and graduation rates compared to other institutions in the state, in part because of the financial challenges experienced by many of their students. Together, these trends show a strong need for financial aid at Virginia's access institutions. I provided a lot of information about financial aid, unmet need, and student debt. The figures I've shared are largely for the 2020-21 academic year because that was the most recent data available during our research. The blue dots on slide 13 show state financial aid funding levels by institution at the time of these trends. I do want to note, though, that for fiscal year 24, as Hal mentioned earlier, the General Assembly has significantly increased state aid funding. The funding increase that you've provided will undoubtedly address a large portion of the $162 million in remaining tuition and fee need that I cited back on slide 10. Its exact impact is unknown, though, because we don't yet know the higher education costs, students' expected family contributions, or the financial aid awards for the coming academic year when the funds will be spent. And Madam Chair, I'll pause briefly here to answer any questions about higher education costs and financial aid trends.
Yes, Senator Norman.
Madam Chairman, I know I'm redundant and sound like a broken record. It's an issue I've been concerned about for a number of years, and I continue to believe that the General Assembly needs to impose greater discipline on higher education. And there's one or two particular institutions that I am concerned about. But my question to you, and I think it's only on the perimeters of the study that you did, and it was not focused, but are you aware of whether or not any of our four-year institutions embed in their tuition and fees financial assistance for needy students?
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, we did ask the institutions that when we went to the various campuses or met with financial aid staff. And it's our understanding that none of them include that particular breakout in the information that they send to students and their families.
Madam Chairman, I find that particularly perplexing because my staff has been trying to get that information and it has not been forthcoming. And it is my understanding that at least one institution embeds in their tuition and fees financial assistance for needy students and do not disclose it. So maybe you could follow up on that. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, Senator Norman, just to clarify, would you like us to follow up on whether they are including that information or the reasoning behind it?
Madam Chairman, I'm not particularly interested in the reason behind it. I'm interested in whether or not it is an embedded fee in tuition and fees that are being charged, and whether one is disclosed, and whether or not those families that actually borrow money are paying any portion of that.
We'd be happy to follow up on that.
Madam Chair. Here. Sorry, down here.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Tracy.
Senator Norman, I just wanted to clarify for you all that we do have in our report an appendix D, that talks about how institutional aid or institutional funds is used for student financial aid. And we'd be happy to share any additional information that we have on that we used in our research to develop that appendix. But we anticipated that question. We were hoping that by including that information in the report, that it might provide you some more information than you have been receiving up to this point.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator McPike.
Thank you. In your report, did you also take a look at the historical state contribution to tuition over this period of time, over the last 10, 20 years as well?
Madam Chair, Senator McPike, we did over time look at just at a very high level some of the tuition and fee levels and the total costs. We do also have some historical funding information from CHEV, but I do not believe we have the historical funding in the report. We primarily focus on the funding that you'll see the total amount for 2020-21, and then that breakdown of how that looks for the coming FY24 year.
Madam Chair, one follow-up.
Yes, Senator McPike.
Thank you. I guess in addition to that, there seems to be a convergence, one of which is the state's portion of actually contributing to the higher education per student has gone down over the period. At the same time, I think it's in table 2.1, the student's ability to pay has also dropped. So there's a convergence of both the ability of a family to pay for it, as well as the rising and lessening of the state's contribution to it at the same time. And so I think there's some, important context to what the state's total portion of contribution has been historically to where it is today, as well at the same time converging families. I think that's highlighted in the report. That's really important. The ability to pay has decreased during the last decade as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Okay, now I'll share our findings on the state's financial aid program requirements. The state's largest financial aid grant programs for in-state undergraduates are the Virginia Guaranteed Assistance Program, or VGAP, and the Virginia Commonwealth Award Program. These two programs provided a combined $175 million in state financial aid to in-state undergraduates, and they accounted for over 95% of state aid funds spent in the 2020-21 year. Virginia has several smaller state aid programs for specific student populations attending the public 4 years. These programs are described briefly in Table 1.1 of our written report, if you're interested. Students must meet several eligibility requirements to receive VGAP or Commonwealth Award grants. First and foremost, VGAP recipients must demonstrate financial need. VGAP also has several requirements for credit completion, including that recipients stay full-time and progress a class level each year. And VGAP has 2 GPA requirements as well, one for a minimum high school GPA of 2.5 and the other for a minimum college GPA of 2.0. Similar to VGAP, the Commonwealth Award program is need-based, but recipients can take as few as 6 credit hours per semester. They also have to meet their institution's satisfactory academic progress, or SAP requirements, which includes a minimum GPA that is 2.0 or slightly lower. 2 additional things to know about these programs is that they are separate. Students can only receive an award from one at a time. In addition, VGAP provides the larger state grant awards. For need-based programs like VGAP and Commonwealth Award, states should minimize the number of student eligibility requirements to improve access according to experts. Need-based programs that award funds based only on student need and not other criteria are most effective at making college accessible and affordable. Need-based programs should direct aid to the neediest students, streamline eligibility criteria, and limit eligibility criteria to be need-based. Merit-based aid programs can also be beneficial, but these programs are not as effective at helping students who struggle academically. Based on this information, we found that VGAP's academic performance requirements related to credit completion and GPA prevent students from accessing the state's largest grants. To unpack that a bit, VGAP's requirements that recipients be full-time and progress prevent many needy students from receiving grants. They're a significant barrier to access, especially for part-time students. About 1/4 of in-state undergraduates, over 24,000 students, were part-time in 2020-21 and therefore ineligible for VGAP. Over 30% of these students had no ability to pay because they had $0 of expected family contribution. Even among students who initially met VGAP's requirements, many lost eligibility because they took fewer credit hours than required to be full-time and progress. Instead of having these requirements, other states and Virginia's Commonwealth Award allow students to receive prorated grants depending on the total number of credit hours they're taking. A minimum number of credit hours is often set to ensure that students are degree seeking. VGAP's GPA requirements also prevent some needy students from accessing VGAP, but they affect fewer students than the full-time and progression requirements. VGAP's 2.5 high school GPA requirement prevents about 2% of students from receiving VGAP, and the 2.0 GPA requirement prevents about 5% of students from receiving VGAP. Both GPA requirements are fairly duplicative because institutions already have their own minimum admission standards for enrolling students, and they verify students' academic performance using SAP requirements. Many other states, Virginia's Commonwealth Award, and federal Pell all use institution SAP requirements for state grant eligibility. We have 3 recommendations in our report to streamline VGAP's eligibility requirements to better enable needy students to access state grants. First, we recommend the General Assembly consider allowing in-state undergraduates who are enrolled in at least 6 credit hours to receive prorated VGAP grants. Madam Chair, this would go a long way towards improving access to VGAP grants because it would remove the biggest barrier for part-time students. Part-time students would no longer be disqualified from VGAP, and students would not lose VGAP for temporarily falling below a full-time course load. The second and third recommendations are for the General Assembly to consider eliminating VGAP's current GPA requirements and instead rely on institutions' existing academic performance standards. Another finding that emerged from our research on state financial aid program requirements is that having 2 separate state grant programs causes confusion among students, and it increases the workload of financial aid staff. Based on feedback from SHEV and financial aid staff at Virginia's public institutions, it's clear that combining VGAP and the Commonwealth Award grant programs would be beneficial. Students would no longer have to understand two separate sets of eligibility criteria and award amounts, which is something that's a source of confusion currently. Financial aid staff would also not have to switch students between two programs as their eligibility changes. We spoke with staff at SHEV's peer agency in North Carolina and learned that they are currently consolidating their multiple state grant programs into a single program to simplify their aid and improve the administrative efficiency. As far as implementation goes, if Virginia combined its grant programs, the remaining programs should ideally reflect the Commonwealth Awards eligibility requirements, which are more accessible to needy students. Therefore, we recommend the General Assembly consider eliminating VGAP and integrating it with the Virginia Commonwealth Award Program. Madam Chair, I'll pause here for any questions.
Yes, Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do you know the history of the current design of these grant programs? Why were they set up like that, as far as who gets it and how much?
Madam Chair, Delegate Wilt, that's a question that we asked SHEV and the public institutions, and as best we can tell, the Commonwealth Award is a longstanding program. It existed before VGAP and some of the more recent eligibility requirements were put into place. But to summarize, we were told it's just operated this way, and that's why both programs still exist.
Delegate Orrock.
Madam Chairman, if may, does any part of your study look at the degree completion between the two programs now? Do we see, because of the different academic requirements, do we see a higher completing a degree in VGAP versus Commonwealth Award, or are they comparable?
Madam Chair, Delegate Orrock, that's a good question. We did not look at graduation rates broken out by the different programs. One of the reasons that wasn't an analysis we did is it would be difficult to consistently assess whether a student got one or the other. As we understand it, some students have to switch back and forth between the programs over time. So it sounds like it's not always the case that a student would get VGAP all the way through their undergraduate time or a Commonwealth Award, but it's a good question.
Madam Chair.
Senator McPike.
I was going to speak, but I think one follow-up is important to note that I think is in here, and probably you've run across it, which is between the institution of SHEV's tracking if Chair Howell transfers from George Mason to another, they don't necessarily connect the outcomes between the universities. Is that correct? And so tracking across is somewhat visibly difficult at this point. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Senator McPike, I believe that might be the case, though SHEV might be able to better speak to that type of tracking. Okay. Now I'll turn to my last section to discuss financial aid program awards and funding. The way Virginia's financial aid is currently structured, institutions have different policies for awarding VGAP and Commonwealth grants. Each institution adopts its own financial aid awarding schedule, which lays out which metric will be used to measure students' need, which students are eligible for state grants based on their level of need, and the maximum state grant awards. State law currently allows institutions to design their own schedules and award state grants differently, as long as the larger awards are for students with more need. Slide 27 will show what two financial aid award schedules look like in practice. They're pretty detailed, so I'm going to have them appear one at a time, starting with Virginia State Schedule for VGAP grants. Virginia State Schedule is based on remaining student financial need, which is the amount of need they have after other aid is applied, like federal Pell. A student with about $17,000 or more in remaining need gets the maximum VGAP award. And students with remaining need as low as about $10,900 can receive awards, with students below that ineligible. VMI schedule also uses remaining need, but it's different. Students who cannot get an award at Virginia State can get one at VMI because VMI's schedule provides awards to students with a remaining need as low as $6,000. And I'll just leave that up here for a few seconds. Okay. And you've just seen how awarding schedules differ between two institutions, and there are even more variations when you compare all 15 institution schedules. This is important because students with similar need end up receiving different state grant awards depending on the institution they attend because of the variation across awarding schedules. This bar chart shows the median VGAP grants for students with no ability to pay relative to their tuition and fee costs by institution. As you can see, there's a wide range of awards spanning from $3,800 per student at UVA Wise to $18,000 per student at William & Mary. Having different awarding schedules and amounts isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, when we looked at how this variation affected student state grant awards, we found that some institutions direct state aid to students with comparatively less need, even though there are other students with more remaining unmet need. With the discretion that institutions have to develop their own awarding schedules, we saw that they awarded $37 million in state grants to students with comparatively less need in 2020-21. The breakout for that was $5.8 million to students with minimal need and $31.2 million to students with moderate need. These students do have legitimate need, especially those with moderate need, who are often referred to as the missing middle because they aren't eligible for federal Pell Grants. However, awarding state grants to them does not use limited state funds as prudently as possible to assist the students most reliant on state aid. Slide 31 shows the proportion of state aid awarded to students with comparatively less need by institution. The darkest portion of the bar shows the state aid awarded to students with minimal need, and the next lighter shade shows awards to students with moderate need. A few of these institutions are using institutional aid to meet the needs of their neediest students, which explains why they have some state aid going to less needy students. But that's not the case for most institutions. At VCU, for example, the neediest students still had $30 million of need after state and institutional aid awards. We have some more information on this in Chapter 4 of our written report. To more effectively target limited state grant funding to students with the greatest need, the state should be more prescriptive about student eligibility for state aid. Additional parameters would help direct limited state funding to the neediest students statewide. There are two approaches the state could take to set such parameters, which I'll describe in more detail in just a few slides. One of those approaches would be to implement a state awarding schedule, statewide awarding schedule, and another would be to restrict institutions' ability to provide state grants to less needy students. Both approaches have advantages and disadvantages. Which approach is most advantageous is a judgment call best left up to policymakers. Regardless of which approach is taken, a change is needed if the state wishes to better target grant funding to the neediest students. That's why we have a recommendation for the General Assembly to consider establishing additional parameters for state grant awards that ensure public institutions are prioritizing state grant funding to students with the most financial need. As I mentioned, the first possible approach to implementing additional parameters is through a statewide awarding schedule. A statewide schedule would specify for public institutions the level of financial need that qualifies students for state aid and the size of individual students' awards. All public institutions would be required to use the same schedule. This would ensure state grants are calculated consistently for students with similar needs, which would improve the predictability of awards for students. A statewide schedule would be a large-scale change, and there would be some drawbacks. Institutions would lose their discretion over awarding state grant funds, though they would still have discretion over awarding their institutional aid funds. A statewide schedule could also result in some institutions having to offer smaller state grants than they do currently. That's something that SCHEV should try to minimize when designing the schedule. State grant funding would be allocated differently to public four-years under a statewide schedule. Instead of awarding to students with moderate and minimal need, funding would be redistributed to give larger awards to the neediest students. This bar chart on slide 36 shows the actual funding that institutions received in fiscal year 21 under the current awarding schedule. If state grant awards went to the neediest students first, and awards were about $5,000 per student, then George Mason, Old Dominion, and Virginia Commonwealth University would receive the most state grant funding. These institutions have the largest populations of needy students who would be prioritized under a statewide schedule. Some institutions with high-need students, like Norfolk State, Virginia State, and UVA-Wise, would see a decrease in their total state funds because their student populations are relatively small. But the neediest students at these institutions should receive larger state grants under a well-designed statewide schedule. Still, we understand the legislature has provided additional funding to Norfolk State and Virginia State and may not want to see their funding decrease. That's why we have a policy option in our report that would avoid state grant funding decreases at the public HBCUs. The other option for improving the way institutions award state financial aid is to require public institutions to restrict state grants to the neediest students. Restricting state aid to the neediest students would prevent institutions from awarding VGAP and Commonwealth Award grants to students with less financial need, and instead redirect funds to larger grants for the neediest students. This approach would be more incremental change than a statewide schedule because it would preserve institutions' discretion to make state grant awards for students below the restriction. Although a restriction would be an improvement to the existing system, it would not alter the current distribution of state funds or improve the consistency or understandability of state grant awards for students. Madam Chair, slide 39 just recaps my key findings for you. I won't read through them for the sake of time. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Lauren, are there questions? No, there aren't any questions. It's obvious, I'm sure, to everybody that we're going longer than usual, but I would like to ask that the following speakers stay within what they were instructed would be advisable. That would help. So next is Peter Blake.
Thank you, Madam
Lauren.
Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the commission. I'll certainly follow those instructions, Senator Howe. My name is Peter Blake. I'm the director of the State Council of Higher Education. I want to thank the professional JLARC team with whom we've had the opportunity to work as it prepared this report, notably Director Greer, Associate Director Smith, and Project Leader Axel, Senior Associate Weber. Your staff not only affirmed many of the things we at SHEV have been working on, but it also challenged us to think anew, so we're grateful for that. You have my letter in your materials, so I'll be very brief. The majority of the recommendations in the report align or build upon our recent SHEV actions and recommendations. We particularly support the recommendations that would streamline and simplify state aid. Doing so will make it easier to explain and open doors to more Virginians. We also agree with the recommendations about more transparency in how financial aid is allocated to institutions and the role the council itself should play in these decisions. Our letter offers a short list of considerations during implementation, and we look forward to working with you and others to meet the overall goals of the report. As you can see, this is a complex area. There are opportunities and challenges along the way. We would ask for some flexibility as we explore alternatives that provide a simpler award model and that addresses the needs of low-income families regardless of where they are enrolled. Finally, we're grateful for your ongoing support for higher education, and in particular for the student financial aid historic increase that you provided during the last General Assembly session. That action alone will help address some of the findings in this report. I would call attention again to slide 13 that shows some of those institutions that face the greatest shortage of funding in the findings from a year or two ago are those that got the greatest increase under the additional financial aid that you provided. Thanks again for the opportunity to comment, and I'll take questions at a later date.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Okay. Hal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The final item on the agenda is our review of the large surplus in the DB 529 fund, which is the fund that supports the state's higher education prepaid tuition plans. Given the late hour, we're going to reduce the length of this presentation and try to make it more concise. I do think it's important to make a few comments before I invite Jamie up here to make the presentation that are relevant. I'll try to make my comments shorter than they would have been. This is a unique opportunity to use these surplus funds and put them to some other uses, including providing more access and affordability to students in Virginia. Also to return some dollars to contract holders, 529 contract holders. But I do want to point out that there are two significant points of contention between JLARC staff and Virginia 529. And I think it's important to keep these points of contention in mind as you hear the presentation. First, there's a clear difference of opinion about how much of the excess surplus can be safely withdrawn from the fund and put to meaningful uses. The actuary we worked with, which is a national firm with extensive experience in defined benefit plans, has concluded that a substantial amount of the surplus can be withdrawn from the fund. Based on the work of the actuary and with the proper safeguards in place, we are confident that withdrawing an amount consistent with the guidelines outlined in our report will in no way jeopardize the solvency of the DB 529 fund. And the assertions you will hear from Virginia 529, either today or in the future, to the contrary, are simply not supported. And we also disagree that there needs to be significant additional analysis or a different analysis before the General Assembly moves forward. A second important point of contention is who should have the ultimate authority to oversee the withdrawal of the excess funds and the precise amounts that are to be withdrawn. Some discretion will need to be afforded a decision-making body in making these withdrawals. We have concluded that it's essential to have a committee that is independent of 529 and its board to perform this role. Virginia 529 disagrees, but there are important reasons for establishing an independent committee. Most importantly, the board has simply not demonstrated that it has the needed perspective to properly carry out the responsibility. If it did, the board would have begun taking significant action much sooner to address the accumulating surplus, and Virginia 529 would not be currently sitting on such a large surplus. I want to thank Mary Morris and her staff for their cooperation, providing the data that we needed to do the review. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jamie Bitts, who is the project leader for this. Kimberly Sartay oversaw the study. Jamie?
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Commission. As Hal said, my name is Jamie Bitts, and I'll be presenting the results from our review of the Virginia 529's defined benefit 529 surplus funds. I do know the hour is late, and so I will try to be a little bit more brief than I had intended. This slide just shows you the study motion passed by JLARC last year. And then this slide just shows you the primary research activities that we used for the study. Just to briefly summarize our findings, we found that the Defined Benefit 529 Fund, or DB 529 Fund, has substantially more assets than it needs to pay all obligations to contract holders. We found that $1.3 billion in actuarial surplus funds could be removed over 5 years and then returned to legacy prepaid contract holders and used to support higher education access and affordability programs. An independent committee and not the Virginia 529 board should oversee the withdrawal of those surplus funds. And finally, a dedicated higher education fund could be established to fund access and affordability programs. Madam Chair, I have 3 parts to my presentation this morning, and I'll start first with some very brief background information. Now, Virginia 529 operates 2 defined benefit savings programs. One is the Legacy Prepaid 529 program, which was open for 24 years and closed in 2019. It does still continue to pay benefits to contract holders. The second program, the successor to that program, is the Tuition Track Portfolio, or TTP program, and that just opened in 2021. And then Virginia 529 does combine these two programs into a single defined benefit 529 or DB 529 fund. The DB 529 fund currently has two revenue sources. By far the largest is the investment returns on the assets in the fund, and then the fund does continue to receive payments from contract holders who are paying for the contracts that they purchased through either of the programs. Over a 16-year period, Virginia 529 did allocate $350 million in net administrative fee proceeds to the fund. They did that in order to enhance its funded status. It receives those fees mainly from the National College America program that it sponsors, and that is a separate program from the Legacy Prepaid and TTP programs. You can see on this slide that the funded status and the actuarial surplus of the DB 529 fund have grown significantly over the past decade. As of June of 2021, the funded status was 194%, and the actuarial surplus, the corresponding actuarial surplus was about $1.6 billion. Now, the market obviously has been declining recently. That's had a fairly modest impact on the DB 529 fund, and so as of June of this year, the funded status had declined to about 188%, and the actuarial surplus had dropped to about $1.4 billion. And Madam Chair, I'll pause here briefly just in case there are any questions.
I don't see any.
This next section of the presentation just addresses the availability of DB 529 surplus funds. Now, Virginia 529 does need to maintain a high enough funded status in its DB 529 fund in order to be able to pay all obligations to its contract holders. The higher the funded status, the greater the probability that there will be sufficient assets to meet all of those obligations. There also needs to be enough funds in liquid assets to make the required benefit payments each year. The investment consultant that we worked with recommended that the fund have, at any point in time, at least 10 years, enough liquidity for at least 10 years of benefit payments. Now, based on the analysis from our actuarial consultant, we found that the DB 529 fund has a funded status that is higher than what's reasonably needed to pay all future obligations to contract holders. Now, the independent actuary we worked with advised us that a funded status of 125% is reasonable for a defined benefit program. It's reasonable because increasing the funded status above that level really provides little additional assurance that there'll be enough assets to pay all obligations. And so if you look on the slide here, you can see that at a funded status of 125%, that corresponds to a 90% probability of having sufficient assets to pay all obligations. And it's really above that point where you can have significant increases in the funded status of the fund and still only provide an additional probability of having sufficient assets of just a couple of percentage points, if that. It's also important to understand that if no surplus funds are withdrawn, that the actuarial surplus will continue to increase, and it's projected to reach more than $3.7 billion over the next 22 years. Now, based on the analyses from the actuarial and investment consultants that we worked with, we've concluded that based on the 2021 valuation numbers, $1.3 billion in surplus funds could be withdrawn from the fund over the course of 5 years and still maintain that funded status of at least 125% and enough liquidity to make the required benefit payments. Now, given the decline in the funded status and the actuarial surplus, the amount that could be removed at this moment is a little bit lower than the $1.3 billion that we estimated. Now, removing $1.3 billion and still maintaining that funded status of 125% is based on the most realistic assumptions, those being a 5.5% investment return and then a 6% long-term tuition growth. 5.5% return, the return assumption is approved by the Virginia 529 board, and they do that in consultation with their investment consultant. That's also the return rate that was forecast by the investment consultant that we worked with. And then the 6% tuition growth that we're assuming here is also the official assumption approved by the Virginia 529 board. Now, using moderately conservative, less likely assumptions, more than $900 million could still be removed from the fund and maintain that funded status of 125%. And that's based on a slightly lower investment return of 4.5%, and then a slightly higher tuition growth assumption of 7%. Now, both those withdrawal amounts of $1.3 billion and $900 million are based on removing funds incrementally over 5 years, and that's the minimum time frame that our consultants recommended for something like this. A 5-year time frame protects the actuarial soundness by allowing for a more gradual decline in the funded status as funds are removed, and then it also provides enough liquidity for more than 20 years of benefit payments. And so, Madam Chair, we have a recommendation that the General Assembly consider directing in statute the removal of surplus funds from the DB 529 fund in annual increments over 5 years, at least 5 years, and then up to an amount that would maintain a funded status of 125% through FY44, and using the investment return and tuition growth assumptions that are approved by the Virginia 529 board. And we also found that an independent committee should review the scheduled withdrawal of surplus funds each year, and then reduce or pause further withdrawals if that's needed to maintain the funded status or the liquidity of the DB 529 fund. Now, an independent committee could review updated actuarial and investment modeling each year, and then if that showed that the scheduled withdrawal would lower the funded status below that 125%, or reduce liquidity below that 10-year threshold, then it would have the discretion to pause or reduce further withdrawals. The independent committee could also monitor the DB 529 fund over the long term to determine whether any additional surplus funds remain that could be removed. There's several reasons why a substantial surplus may continue to accrue, and probably the most primary one, I should say, is if substantially less than that $1.3 billion in surplus funds is removed. And so we have a recommendation that the General Assembly consider establishing an independent committee to review and approve annual surplus fund withdrawals, and then that it meet at least every 2 years long-term to monitor the funded status of the DB 529 fund. And Madam Chair, I'll pause again for any questions there may be.
Okay. No questions.
This last section of the presentation covers how surplus funds could be used if they are removed from the fund. And so surplus funds can obviously be used in a wide variety of ways, including those that are not necessarily related to higher education. But that said, we focused on how those funds could be used for higher education access and affordability. And we did that in part because the mandate directed us to. And I should point out that to the extent that surplus funds remain in the DB 529 fund and are not withdrawn, they will simply sit collecting investment returns, and the state would likely forego opportunities to improve access and affordability. Now, we found that any surplus funds removed from the DB 529 fund could be used in proportion to the revenue sources of the surplus. And so the current surplus comes from two primary revenue sources. About 60% of it is from payments made by account holders for the contracts that they've purchased. And then the remaining 40% is from administrative fee proceeds that Virginia 529 has allocated to the fund over the years. And so at a high level, the General Assembly could allocate surplus funds based on that split, with 60% of any funds removed being designated for prepaid account holders, and then the remaining 40% of any funds removed being designated for higher education access and affordability programs. And so we do have an option in the report to that effect. Now, if $1.3 billion in surplus funds were removed from the DB 529 fund, about $780 million of that, or 60%, could be returned to legacy prepaid account holders. And we've identified at least three ways that could be done. One thing to keep in mind is that legacy prepaid contract holders receive higher or lower payouts depending on the tuition at the institution that their student attends. So the first option is to just provide additional tuition benefits for the students attending schools with below average tuition. The second option is to provide refunds to the account holders whose contracts were priced above the statewide tuition average when they were purchased. And then finally, a third option is to simply return funds to all account holders in the same amount for each contract that they purchased. And so we have options in the report that the General Assembly could direct that surplus funds designated for account holders be returned using any of those three approaches. The report also includes an option that the General Assembly could give the Virginia 529 board the discretion to determine on its own how to return funds. And then we do also have a recommendation to change statute to provide authority and direction to Virginia 529 to return funds to account holders. We also found that if $1.3 billion in surplus funds was removed from the DB 529 fund, about 40% of that, or $520 million, could be used for higher education access and affordability programs. Now, the opportunity to use surplus funds to improve access and affordability is a really unique one for Virginia. The administrative fee proceeds that make up that 40% of the surplus are almost entirely unrelated to the legacy prepaid program. They're largely from Virginia 529's sponsorship of the National College America program, and upwards of 94% of College America participants live outside the state of Virginia. There are at least 4 types of programs listed here on the slide that could be funded with surplus funds derived from the administrative fee proceeds. In the interest of time, I'll just highlight one, and that would be the use of surplus funds to provide additional grants to help students with tuition and fees at four-year institutions, and particularly at-risk populations such as first-generation college students. So our report lays out each of these as options for how the state could use surplus funds sourced from administrative fee proceeds. And then we also have a recommendation in the report to change statute to authorize their use for those purposes. Finally, Madam Chair, we found that using surplus funds to create a dedicated higher education fund would provide a long-term source of funding for access and affordability programs. Assets from a dedicated fund could be made available to the DB 529 fund to address any concerns with its solvency or liquidity. And finally, the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, or SCHEV, could is the most appropriate entity to make allocations from that dedicated fund, and that Virginia 529 is the most appropriate entity to manage the investment of those assets. This slide just shows you the amounts of annual funding that could be available from a dedicated fund depending on its lifespan. And I should say here, the primary advantage of a dedicated fund is that it would work like an endowment in the sense that it would allow the state to help a larger number of students over a longer period. The downside, of course, is that it would provide a smaller amount of funding, at least in the initial years. The most effective way to allocate dedicated funds each year would be for the General Assembly to put in statute the types of programs that a dedicated fund could support, and then give a state entity the discretion to determine the specific programs and funding levels within those guidelines. And we think that SCHEV is the most appropriate entity to allocate funds within those guidelines. The key reason being that its mission and staff expertise are directly in higher education. We also think the assets in a dedicated fund should remain commingled with DB 529 funds and be managed by Virginia 529 investment staff. That would allow the fund to earn a high enough investment return. And if the assets were invested alongside DB 529 funds, then they could be easily made available to the DB 529 fund to strengthen its solvency or liquidity if those ever were to be concerns. And so we have recommendations for creating that dedicated higher education fund, giving SCHEV responsibility for allocating funds from it, and then directing Virginia 529 to manage the investments, the investment of the fund assets. Madam Chair, there are just a few very brief key takeaways to leave you with. One is that whether it's the $1.3 billion or the slightly lower amount, there is a substantial amount of surplus funds in the DB 529 fund that could be safely removed. Taken together, our recommendations really provide a process for removing those surplus funds that includes a number of safeguards to ensure and protect the fund's solvency. And lastly, if surplus funds are not withdrawn, the state is foregoing important opportunities to improve access and affordability. And Madam Chair, that was a very brief, but hopefully still useful.
That's a long brief.
Summary of our
long brief
presentation.
Senator Sproul.
The surplus, you keep using could be used. And why you couldn't say it could be recommended to be used for education? You said it could use. Now I say I'm a vote for that because this is for the surplus for education and whatever. You keep saying could be. Then what else could it be used for? Then I mean I don't want to be able to say, hey, we're going to use this because he said it could be. The next thing I know is used for something else. Why couldn't you say? Why could you not say that it be recommended to be used for education? What happened instead of could be?
Yeah.
You don't tell a politician could be.
Yeah.
We included these options because the General Assembly does have a significant amount of latitude over how the funds could be used. And specifically to give you the example of returning surplus funds to account holders, there are options for ways to do that. So those were presented as options. By the same token, using the portion of the surplus that's sourced from the administrative fee proceeds, using that for higher education programs.
I got it. Thank you. But Madam Chair, yes, you could change that to say we recommended it will be used. Let us determine. Don't say could be, because I want to give it all to Janet Howell. That's what I recommend.
I support that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Nobody else, right? Okay, and now let's hear from 529.
Yes, and
Oh, I'm sorry.
I would like to just introduce Senator Stosh. He is a member of the board, and he's the chair of the Audit and Actuarial Committee.
Great to see you, Senator.
Thank you, and good morning. Good to see
morning.
all of you, Madam Chair. We've lost our vice chair. I would acknowledge his role, but members of the commission, I do serve on the Board of Trustees of the Virginia 529. That was a post-retirement assignment that the Senate gave to me, and it's been one that's certainly revealing, and it's an awesome task to have the fiduciary responsibility of thousands of accounts and billions of dollars that parents and others are expecting us to manage and to make sure when their children go to college, the funds are there to pay for it. I have very limited time. It looks like you've exhausted your agenda, so I'll just comment on a couple of items. Hal was a little bit hard on us, but I'll be diplomatic in my response. I want to talk to you certainly about the funding status of the DB 529 plans, and we have our own chart. And it's important to know what this is. It's a surplus only in the sense that our actuaries, one time a year, June 30 of each year, takes an assessment of the value of the investments in the fund, which are varied, many, and the risk inherent in those investments, and compares that value to the present value of the future costs of basically tuition and fees of college. So when a parent or other benefactor comes to 529 and invests, they have the belief that whatever they are investing in today's costs or an index for today's college costs will grow at some rate and match the rate of tuition and fees in the future, which is also growing at some rate. So we have the responsibility of monitoring and measuring those rates of growth. This chart here is important because the funded status that we have been monitoring all along made a huge increase between 2020 and 2021. That's because we had a significant return on investments. The rate of return was about 21%. So the fund went up by a third. The board recognizes and understood that and immediately began to look at options, many of which are frankly included in your report. So there's much in the report that we agree with. Our concern is that we have a fiduciary responsibility to the benefactors of these programs to make sure that the funds will be there when they're required. Oftentimes that takes a 30-year look into the future. So if you can tell us what the investment returns will be and what the tuition will be for the next 30 years, we can manage this fund a little better. Indeed, I was appreciative of the earlier presentation on financial aid to colleges. How well you moderate tuition impacts the rate of growth in tuition. So you'll notice in this series of years that we have here, there were 2 years or 3 years in which the weighted average tuition was between 10.5% and 22%. Well, we are assuming 6% in our assumptions on average, weighted average. You'll also notice there were 2 recession periods in here. So in all likelihood, while we believe the funded status is certainly produces opportunities for us to look at returning funds to account holders, and we believe that the administrative fees that we are generating provide opportunities for extended partnerships and other activities that would help low-income, particularly students, have access and affordability. If you read your report, you'll find that the staff did a wonderful job of commenting on a program we call SOAR. That's a program that started in 2010 that's been very effective in addressing needs of low-income students by sending advisors into public schools, over 100 schools, mentoring, advising, working with, administering a program of community service, minimum grade level, minimum participation in terms of class attendance or maximum attendance, and they must be eligible for free and reduced lunch. So it's a program dedicated to those who have the most difficult time accessing affordable education. It is working well. Your staff have recognized that. We would like to expand that. In the past 15 months, as we were monitoring the fund balance, we realized there were opportunities. We created a number of partnerships, including one with Chev with their Gear Up program, and some community partnerships that we were prepared to implement. Unfortunately, when we submitted a request for spending authority to spend those administrative fees that are non-general funds, that authority was not approved last year in the budget process. So if we are to move forward in these recommendations from your staff, we must have spending authority to carry out those plans. Why is spending authority required? In the state process, even non-general funds have to be appropriated, and those non-general funds have to be issued under a spending authority. So we would please ask you, recognize our request for spending authority so we can move forward on these programs. Again, on the funded status, who knows what it should be? The same actuaries that did the study for this report has a funded status in Maryland of 161%, Michigan 154, Nevada 179. Some of those states have the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth behind the fund. So if we had the support of the faith and credit, or if we had access to general funds, as perhaps the retirement system does, then our funded status is not that concerning to us. But if I can show you the chart that indicates the probability, which is up there, I don't know that our board can carry out its fiduciary responsibility and be able to say we have a 90% probability of meeting our obligations. If we had some other type of support other than self-funding, perhaps we could. But this is concerning to us that you have a recommendation of 125% funded status, which mathematically only gives us a 90% probability of meeting the obligations we have to our parents and other benefactors. So I wish we had more time. We have submitted a detailed report to you talking about the issues in the report and assuring you that we are moving forward with looking at the funded status. We have a risk assessment committee in place that's looking at how much risk can we take, how much of this funded status can we use for alternative higher education purposes. And particularly, we have the supplementary programs using our non-general fee funds to support that we need your funding strategy. So we would ask you for time, allow our board, which is made up of 11 members, 4 of whom are senior executives at the state controller, the treasurer, the director of Chev, and the chancellor of the 23 community colleges are all on our board. The other 7 are appointees that you and the governor make, and these are people by statute that must have substantial experience in finance, in accounting, in economics, in investments, and all of the things that are needed for us to assume the responsibility, the fiduciary responsibility of managing the fund. So I guess we would ask for time, give us an opportunity to respond thoughtfully to any of these recommendations, but also allow us to show you the progress that we have made and are making in some of these very areas. So I have several board members here with me. Mr. Dante Jackson is here. Dr. Greg Herndon is here from the community college system. Director Peter Blake was here, and we're hoping to create an umbrella partnership with Chev to try to look at all of these programs together. As you noticed from the presentations earlier, The worst thing you can have are program efforts that are divided and dispersed among many agencies in terms of efficiency. So we would ask you to not adopt any changes that would undermine our fiduciary responsibility. That would put you in a position where you would assume part of that responsibility if you statutorily do that. So I think you would be pleased if you give us an opportunity to come back to you with not only a report, but a request for legislation before next session so that we can move forward on some of these programs. But again, I emphasize the need. We need to have spending authority to spend money we already have. And we would need that if we do anything with this funding status, that relieves any funds. But 125% means we can only meet 90% of our obligations according to our actuary. So that's something that we would have disagreement on. Madam Chair, I wish I had more time. There's a lot to tell you. I can share with you there's life after the legislature.
Oh, good. That's great news.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator McPike.
Thank you. Thank you. That was probably the smoothest ask for a $500 million expenditure authority I've ever seen, and I can tell why the senator did so well in the Senate. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, it's complicated because these are all non-general funds, and you would think we have total discretion, but we do not. We need your authority to spend the funds that we generate.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Senator
is it possible
Sproul.
that we could them back and give them the time that they need? Because now it sounds to me there should be, I don't want to use the word a conflict, but you got two different opinions. And I would love him to come back to finish up and give them what they seem to be the problem that we can be worked out. I don't want him to comment because he keeps talking to the lawyer. I want to get up and go home. So
And I'm trying to remember our meeting schedule. I think we only have one more meeting and it's already jam-packed.
Well,
But
we will come
I
back
look-
to you with a legislative request if we
That
may.
would work.
Okay.
All right.
And I look forward to our continuing dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, is there any more business? Hal?
You'll be relieved to know, Madam Chair, that concludes the agenda. Appreciate all of you who've stayed this long. Just will tell you the final meeting of the year will be December 12th. We'll be presenting the findings from our review of the state's community service boards system, as well as our review of dual enrollment. I would just want to note one other thing. At the December meeting, we're also going to update you on the progress at the Virginia Employment Commission in making their needed changes. We'll report on how well the modernization is going, how well the backlog has been addressed, and the quality of the customer service that's being provided by VEC. Thank you again for your attention.
And thank you, the whole staff.